7 students gathered in a chapel on Montmartre Hill and vowed to continue their companionship after finishing graduate programs at the University of Paris. They would live in evangelical poverty and go on a mission to Jerusalem. They called themselves Amigos en el Señor, friends in the Lord.
It's always said that the Jesuits were founded by Ignatius of Loyola. But I like the thought that the Jesuits were founded by a committee, not by one man. And it's crucial because if the real mainspring of Jesuit spirituality is companionship, then our being together in a company is really right out of that reality, that we are together in a companionship.
You know, Ignatius is a very hard person to get to know. I think I really know him. And you get inside of him from the way he acts, more than from what he writes. He's a person who just has big ideas, crazy, almost dreamy ideas. And you say, well, all of us, sometime or other, seem to have those kinds of ideas. And I think that's really great. He never loses that.
He was a man given to the vanities of the world, and what he enjoyed most was warlike sport, with a great and foolish desire to win fame.
Íñigo López de Loyola, who later took the name Ignatius, was the youngest son of a nobleman of the mountainous Basque province of northern Spain. Trained in the courtly manner of the time of King Ferdinand, he dreamed of the glories of knighthood and wore his sword and breastplate with a proud arrogance.
When Ignatius was born in 1491, you were just ending basically the Middle Ages, and you were certainly entering into the Renaissance. So he was a man on the edge of two worlds.
Europe of the late 15th century was a world of discovery and invention. European explorers sailed west to the Americas and south to Africa, and scholars uncovered the buried civilizations of Greece and Rome. The printing press fed a new hunger for knowledge among a growing middle class. It was the end of chivalry and the rise of a new humanism. It was a time of radical change, social upheaval, and war. In a quixotic attempt to defend the border fortress of Pamplona against the French artillery, Íñigo's right leg was shattered by a cannonball. His French captors, impressed by Íñigo's courage, carried him on a litter to his family home at Loyola.
His condition was serious, and all the doctors and surgeons who were summoned from many places decided that the leg should be broken again and the bones reset. He never said a word, nor showed any sign of pain other than clenching his fists.
Íñigo had only 2 books to fill the months of his convalescence: The Life of Christ and A Lives of the Saints. His imagination stirred, and he began to examine himself.
In the course of his convalescence, he had a series of experiences of the immediacy and the love of God that completely changed his life. He had a whole series of daydreams. He'd dream of great feats of arms. He'd think about that for a while. Then he'd daydream about doing great things for God. And then he began asking himself, what's the result of these daydreams? The terms he used, what brings me desolation and what brings me consolation? When do I feel good at the end of these dreams, and which kind?
To the dismay of his family, Íñigo conceived a plan to go to Jerusalem. He set off on a mule, beginning a pilgrimage that in one sense continues today.
He started off serving God, knowing hardly anything about how that was to be done. His view of what you could do as a Christian was, well, if St. Dominic did this or St. Francis did this, by heaven, I can do just as much.
Exchanging his courtier's velvet for sackcloth robes and a pilgrim staff, he hung his weapons on an altar to Mary in a night-long vigil.
He left at daybreak so as not to be recognized, and he did not take the main road, but a detour to a town called Manresa.
He stayed in a hospice in Manresa for almost a year. He begged alms, he ate no meat, he let his hair and fingernails grow, all the while seeking people who would talk with him about God.
The most interesting and the most important thing that he did there was a continuation of something that had begun very primitively at Loyola. He began to do a much more careful analysis of what brought on desolation and what brought on consolation and what the results of them were and what it did for him himself in his own life and in his own reactions. And he began to note those things down. Those were the beginnings, the very primitive beginnings of the spiritual exercises.
Spiritual exercises are a way to go through a prayer experience to discover what your own deepest and most authentic desiring is, and to enact that, to find the courage to enact that. First time they were given to me, I was 16 going on 12, you know? And so I had notebooks that were this long and full of all kind of blather, right? But then I did them again when I was in my 30s. And that time, I began to understand how this unfolds within you. You know? This is a structure to help the director understand what the person is going through, and then to suggest what comes next. And in the book, all 30 days are laid out, right, very carefully, and some material for each of these hours is gathered together in the back, because, of course, in Inigo's day, people didn't have a Bible.
It's a small book, as a matter of fact. And it's certainly not a book that you'd read for its literary merit. In fact, it could become quite boring. But the whole point of the exercise is that it's a handbook for somebody who has already experienced them and is experienced in helping others to go through them.
You have to see Inigo walking along to go to a small shrine. As he passed a broad space in the river, he sat for a while, and while he was sitting there, he began to have an insight into how all contingent things, all creatures that come and go, the river flowing past, come from God's eternity moment by moment. Now, with that basis, then what I am to do today and tomorrow becomes a matter of dialogue between me and God. So when we talk about why you go through spiritual exercises, a good way to think about it is, I'm going to go through these exercises in order to discover what God is hoping in me, for me and for my life world, because God's project is now written in the human heart.
The point of the exercises is freedom. How do you become free in accord with your talents, as I with my talents, with my limitations, or you with your limitations? How do I become free enough to respond to the grace of God?
The crux of the Ignatian vision is a spiritual humanism that is at once worldly and warmly human. It is a religious outlook on life that sees God immersed deeply in all creation and all human endeavor. It takes for its own the words of the poet Terence, "Nothing human is strange to me, because nothing is merely human."
When winter came, he was down with a severe illness, and the city placed him in the house of the father of a certain Ferrara. There he was cared for, and many important ladies, because of the deep regard they now had for him, came to watch over him by night. Because the winter was very cold, the ladies made him dress properly, wear shoes, and cover his head. Meanwhile, the time was approaching when he planned to set out for Jerusalem.
Although explorers had redrawn the world map, for Inigo, Jerusalem was still the center of the universe. Having begged his way across the Mediterranean, the pilgrim looked out over the holy city. God's project for him, he believed, was to be where Christ had been.
He became utterly convinced that God was speaking to him directly, that God was acting in his soul. That is to say, there was spiritual growth and development, and that he was misunderstood and was misapplying some of this communication. So it's not simply a case of being a sinner and being converted, and that's the end of it. No, it's a long, ongoing process, and that God deals, again, God accommodates to one's situation, and is gentle and patient the way a good teacher has to be.
The Franciscan authorities in Jerusalem sent Inigo home. He was endangering their mission by wandering about unattended and holding religious conversations with anyone he encountered. Undaunted, he decided that if he were going to help souls, he had to have an education. Inigo returned to Barcelona and began to study Latin. Frustrated by his lack of progress in Spain's disorganized universities, Inigo went to Paris, the heart of the French Renaissance.
The early decades of the 16th century, of course, were some of the most turbulent and exciting and richest in the whole history of the West. It was that revival, it was really basically a literary movement. And it was a revival of the Latin and Greek classics with the assumption that good literature, the reading and assimilation of good literature, produced good persons who would also be interested in civic virtue and promoting civic life.
Inigo entered the University of Paris, starting a program of Latin, philosophy, and theology.
The Paris experience molded him very, very much in his view of what education was about. That it was an orderly process by which you learned one thing well and then moved on to the next stage of it. We take for granted the idea you go through a course of studies in the course of a year, then you move on to another year or another grade to something that furthers your education. The idea of semesters and years and an orderly progress from one level or step to another, that's a Jesuit invention. And he got that partly out of what he called the modus parisiensis, the Paris way of doing things.
By 1534, Inigo became the center of a small group of like-minded students, all filled with a passion to help souls. He led them through the exercises, and they decided that when they graduated, they would remain together. As the 7 friends in the Lord took their vows, they confirmed a companionship that would last the rest of their lives.
And one of the most amazing things to me about Ignatius and the way he gathered men around him was just he liked, first of all, people different from himself. I don't think he tried to get his own image any time. And in fact, he chose people who were from different countries, not even the same nationality. That's the very first thing he does, is always kind of gather people in who are from other countries than his own. But the only thing you could say that they really had in common was Catholic faith. And they were university students. But somehow, what did he do? He got these guys all enamored to do something with their lives, and I think they kept talking about it among themselves. It just wasn't his vision, but he got other people to talk about their vision, and then it kind of gets shaped by the group.
In 1535, the former courtier completed his studies. At the age of 44, after gaining bachelor's and licentiate degrees, he earned the title of Master of the University of Paris and took the name Ignatius.
It seems as though their project was to go to the Holy Land and try to convert the pagan to Christ, which would have meant they would have been martyred, because it was an absolute law. If you tried to convert someone from Islam, you got your head chopped off. So they knew what they were getting into. When they went to Venice, they intended to take ship. Ships ran every year on pilgrimage to the Holy Land and remain there if they could.
In that year, because of a continuing dispute between Venice and the Turks, the first year in God knows how many years, that ship did not go.
They therefore, while they were waiting, turned their hands to helping souls. They would live in a hospital, which is to say an old bin where you put everyone who was incurably ill, or who was mad, or who was too old and had no one to take care of them. They would work there and bring food, take care of all of their physical needs, clean the place, and then, of course, talk about God to them.
They went to different piazzas and began to preach. On the same day and at the same hour, they began shouting loudly and waving their birrettas to call the people.
Inigo would preach in a mixture of Spanish, Latin, and Italian, which people found hilarious. But he didn't mind as long as they understood Jesu and Grazia, as long as he could get across to them. And the people appreciated what they were doing, that they were coming out of the church into the square to talk about religion.
Time and again, Ignatius used the word magis, more. Be more so you can do more. Learn more so you can serve better.
What have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? And what might I do for Christ? Now, what might I do is the maius. What more? What more? All the Jesuits I know hold at least a job and a half. Most two, you know?
One of the hallmarks of the Jesuits is a consistent commitment to human dignity. It follows from their spiritual humanism. Even before the Jesuits were approved as a religious order, they were involved in ministering to the most marginalized people in their society. Who would be the most marginalized in our own society, but people with sexually transmitted diseases. The first people to whom Jesuits ministered were patients suffering from syphilis.
And the point of the thing was, where is there, at this point, the greatest need, or the place where you might best serve the poor, the sick, the abandoned? Where is there the greatest need and the greatest possibility of service to people?
Ignatius and 5 of the companions were ordained as priests in 1537. They decided to call themselves the Society of Jesus, and they made their way to Rome to offer themselves to the Vicar of Christ. Rome of Pope Paul III bore little resemblance to the capital of the ancient empire. Its palaces and aqueducts lay in ruins. Cattle grazed in the Roman Forum. The companions arrived during the worst winter in 50 years. Crops had failed, and the people were starving.
And it's fair to say that during that winter, the companions begged enough grain from the wealthy to feed about 10% of the poor population of Rome over a number of weeks during that winter.
The House of St. Martha sheltered women who wanted to escape prostitution. Other institutions cared for orphans, teenage girls, and Jewish converts. Confraternities of lay people were founded to run the institutions, so the companions could move on to meet other needs.
Very early, because of their preaching and their learning, they came to the attention of the Pope, Paul III. He had 2 of them, interestingly, come and talk about theological questions with him at the time of his first meal every morning. Now, I don't know what you would think of that, but I've told people that to engage in theological disputation for a late breakfast is to me like pouring gin on cornflakes. When Ignatius mentioned that they still wanted to go to Jerusalem, Paul III said, "Why would you want to go to Jerusalem? Rome can easily be your true and good Jerusalem. There's plenty to do here."
What began in Pamplona's medieval fortress evolved through the religious experience of the companions and matured in the universities of the Renaissance, was eventually confirmed by the Church. On September 27, 1540, the Society of Jesus was formally approved as a religious order. Ignatius reluctantly accepted the position of superior. Until his death in 1556, he directed the society from a small set of rooms in Rome.
The same day he summoned me before supper, with the air of a person who was more recollected than usual, and made a sort of protestation to me, the gist of which was to show the intention, the sincerity with which he had related these things. He said he was quite sure that he had not exaggerated, and that, although he had committed many offenses against our Lord God, after he had begun to serve him, he had never consented to mortal sin. Rather, he had always grown in devotion, that is, ease in finding God, and now more than ever in his whole life. Every time, any hour that he wished to find God, he found him.